Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for coming out on Sunday morning. As Jordan said, this is a topic that Amy has worked on since 2013 with the Pulitzer Center, but actually it's something that she's been interested in since at least 2005. In fact, when we kind of re-met again after I landed at National Geographic about 2.5 years ago, Amy pointed out that in her notes, she had recorded that this was something that she and I actually talked about more than a dozen years ago when I worked at the Open Society Institute here in New York. So she's had a long history thinking about this topic. I think it's really important when we talk about this subject to kind of say up front, this isn't a story that's just about grief and loneliness. This is actually an issue about gender inequality. In many parts of the world, a woman's social status is inextricably linked to the men in their lives. First their husbands, or first their fathers, and later their husbands. So when a woman's husband dies, it's essentially like a social death for her. She's cast out, she's threatened, and they essentially enter a state of widowhood, which for many reasons they can't leave, often legal reasons, or they won't leave for social and cultural reasons. So Amy, started the project in India, and then, as Jordan said, for the magazine, pursued it in Bosnia and Uganda as well. So I want to start out, I guess, really asking Amy how she got interested in the topic of widows. I mean, what drew you to that subject? It's not something this was something we struggled with a lot at the magazine when we were first talking about the issue was, why widows, and really making people understand that it was a story about gender inequality. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks Whitney, thanks Amy, thanks Jordan for all your work on this. It's great to be here and to be able to kind of dig a little deeper into the story. So in 2005, honestly, it was really just out of pure curiosity. I mean, how many of you guys think or know about widows being marginalized? Okay, that was like maybe a quarter of the room, less a little bit. So I was in the same boat where I was kind of like, what? What do you mean? Like, what's this about? And so it was just out of, probably similar to most of you journalists in the room, you just get curious about something and you're like, what's that about? And I happened to be in that region working on something else. So in 2005, I just went to one of these holy cities, Vrindavan, and met with an NGO and actually lived in an ashram for about 5 days just to check it out. And then I came back and it stuck in my mind, but I couldn't quite get my head around it beyond it just being kind of a pitiful story at that point. And I think the gender issues were definitely the most interesting part, but it was so just downtrodden that there wasn't a dynamic aspect to it at that point. And so it wasn't until 2013 when I started to read more about stuff shifting, and also in the wake of a lot of the rape issues in India suddenly coming, they'd always been there, as we all know, but suddenly they were getting reported on. So there was kind of this interesting movement going on, and so it kind of sparked my interest again.
Was that at all sparked also by the founding of International Widows Day, which was in...
No.
Did you even know about that? Or was that something that we kind of came across after we started the story?
I came across afterwards, yeah. It was something that I learned about when I went with a writer, Jess Benko, amazing journalist, and she and I partnered up on that. We both got funded by the Pulitzer Center, and we learned of this. I remember because... it's interesting when you start working with NGOs, sometimes they can get a little competitive about things. And I remember one NGO we were with, this woman heads it, and she said some guy, he started an organization and now he wants to name some Widow's Day after his mother. And she was all cynical about it, but it was kind of an interesting little tidbit there. But it's actually just happened recently. It might have been 2011 or 12, yeah. So.
Yeah, the United Nations recognized International Widows Day in 2011. So there has been a little more attention drawn to it at a more international level. I know there's some photographers in the room, but there are also some journalists who are kind of exploring photography and multimedia. So can you talk a little bit about how you approach your subjects and how you get, I mean, one aspect of your photography that really struck me when we started working together was, I should say Amy's done nearly 20 stories for National Geographic. So, when I came in to kind of work with her, 15, 18, 17, a lot. So it was an interesting experience for me as a new editor at National Geographic to be working with someone who had so many stories under her belt. But can you talk a little bit, one aspect that really struck me about your photography was how intimate you get with your subjects. I mean, even this picture we're looking at right now, for instance, you're right there on a day of mourning. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how you get so close to your subjects and how they allow you to be in their lives?
Yeah, I think of it as a collaboration, I don't even think of it that way. It's purely a collaboration for me. So whenever there's a subject who has agreed and is willing to work with me, then there's an understanding that they find telling the story worthwhile. I mean, there's going to be, you'll see images in here that's more, I kind of think of it as more street photography, like it might just be a scene setter. But when there's images of, like Solomé as a woman here, there's so many women in here that we can really talk about their story, which is awesome. There's been a lot of time before photographing them where working with amazing fixers and journalists who are willing to work with us on the story on the ground, spending a lot of time with the subjects to explain why we're doing it and what we're interested in. And at that point, it truly is a collaboration, and it's a collaboration even with the fixer. Does everybody know what the term fixer means? Is there anybody that doesn't? Okay, it's basically a journalistic term for that person on the ground. When you go to Uganda, who are you going to work with to kind of show you the way and educate you culturally? Probably your translator, help you find a drugstore, whatever you need just to work there, but also more importantly to help you with the story and make your way around the story. So that person is like essential to all the stories, most of the stories that you see in National Geographic or any of the in-depth work that you're going to see here. These people are incredible. Yeah, so that's a huge part of it, and that person, that fixer or translator is on board with the story too, and then you're getting the subjects on board, and these women are smart. They understand, and they value telling their story, and they feel honored to have their story told. And I think there's a lot of explaining on my part with just saying, I need to be here with you to do this well, and they get it. So it's a real collaboration.
Some of those fixers worked very closely with, or maybe were even connected to some of the nonprofits on the ground in certain places. Did you ever feel that or how did you kind of navigate a fine line between making sure you were remaining journalistic and really representing these women's stories versus maybe becoming like a mouthpiece for that particular organization?
Yeah, and that's always, you and I talked about that a lot, being concerned, especially in Uganda, and we'll get a little more into what happened in Uganda working with the NGO there. But it's kind of the same thing. I think you just have to be really transparent, I'm here to tell this story. I'm not here to be your mouthpiece. Are you okay with it? Okay, cool. Let's move forward. You're not okay with it? I can't work with you. So it's just about really clear, transparent communication. And I think the most sophisticated NGOs get it. Yeah. They get what a journalist is trying to do and that they can't be there to just be a mouthpiece. Photographically,
what surprised you most about making the story?
I think that one thing was that we pulled Uganda off. That was a really hard one. When we're telling these stories, we have to have the visual language for it. You can have really great stories, and if you don't have the visual tools to tell it, it's not going to do so great, especially in National Geographic. So there's this bar that's really high, and sometimes it can cut off your nose to spite your face for getting to the story. But we really stuck with it.
I think that was also a place where, just to kind of unpack what she means by we pulled Uganda off, Amy's passion for this project was in India, clearly. That's where she had spent time, made multiple trips. And then Nat Geo comes on board, and we want to expand the story beyond India. And so she's collaborating with an editor, myself, as well as a text editor and a writer. And everyone in the room has a lot of ideas. And we start out by doing kind of a great deal of research on what other countries we're going to go to and why, how we're going to expand the story from a content perspective, and then, of course, hopefully from a visual perspective as well. And I think, we had other ideas initially that we wanted to pursue with the Maasai in Kenya, and we felt in the end, or the research kind of led us to believe that that was too narrow of a story, but it was a pretty visual story. I was pushing hard for Uganda, which we'll get into a little bit, but it's about something called property grabbing, which from a content perspective is really important. It's kind of the main issue that widows struggle with across Africa, and there's been a lot of laws put in place to protect women, which are not really enforced. But it's really hard to make pictures about legal issues. And so I think that was really the challenge for Amy, because it's easy for me to sit on the 4th floor in DC and say, like, yeah, this is a story we need to cover. Now go figure it out and make a picture, and then send Amy off packing to make it happen.
Yeah, and a really, is it non-sexy or unsexy? Not very sexy topic. And the NGO that we worked with, their International Justice Mission, even said, oh my God, thank goodness you're here, because nobody wants to cover this topic. They do a lot of stuff about human trafficking, and most of the journalists want to do stuff on human trafficking, which is really important to cover. But property grabbing is essentially one of the most important economic issues for women throughout Africa and then throughout the world, I would say, with inheritance laws. So we found it to be the most relevant story of our time right now for women. Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the outlook for widows? Maybe in India, where you've spent the most time. I mean, I think that you've witnessed some change over the last decade or more of photographing there. But what's the prospect for further change, or what needs to happen, if anything?
One thing that you and I have said a lot throughout this story is that widows are a really good barometer for the status of women in any one country. And so I would say that widows in India, it's pretty much the same as what you could the outlook for any woman in India. I would say that there's a huge push to shift what's going on, and you can see it. India, of all these places, of the 3 places you're seeing here, is the stigmas are the most visual. There's an expectation for a woman to shave her head, to wear all white, to not wear any jewelry, to possibly live in one of these holy cities. And I also want to say this is not every widow in India, but there are large pockets in the more religious sectors of the country where this is going on. But I think with those visuals are sort of fading away. There's an image in here that looped through. It's of these widows celebrating Holi. They're very colorful. And I think it's on the banner as well. I almost think of that as the will and grace of widows in India. Suddenly there are gay people on, primetime television, and people are like, oh, that's okay, I can handle this. Well, there's a lot of NGOs in India that were trying to do that because it's taboo for these women to put color on or to celebrate or to go to any celebrations or holidays. And so these NGOs get that just showing these women in a different light is going to shift people's minds about widows and what they should be. And that's really valuable. But I think the way deeper issue is the economics of it and the education. So if these women as girls are not educated and they aren't able to have jobs because of their lack of education, it's not going to change. And so that's what happened continuously for me, is like, if you just educate these girls, look out. Like, these women would be fine. And so I think that the widows can be helped right now. There's, we looked at training stuff. They're trying to train even widows like in their 30s and 40s to help them have jobs. But ultimately, it's not going to shift until the girls get educated, and there has to be some economic incentives for that to happen.
Bosnia, which this is the last picture in that section, was the second place we sent Amy to, and I think it was also a challenge for her, and a little bit of an outlier in some ways. We were kind of thinking about the leading causes of widowhood, and wars obviously, leave many widows in their paths. So do you want to talk a little bit about that piece of the story? I think it was kind of the most challenging for you in many ways.
Yeah, so we decided to go to Bosnia, specifically the 20th anniversary of the Srebrenica massacre, which many of you you weren't even around for it, but this was a horrific event in our recent history. And that in and of itself was worthy, like, going there and fully, I was in my 20s when it happened, and I've known the story, but just going there and learning more about it and highlighting it again made it all worth it, because it's such an important story to keep alive. But that's beside the point. That one was challenging, and it was interesting because when I sat down with Susan Goldberg, the editor of the magazine, and I was just showing her projects that I had worked on. I wasn't sitting down to talk about the widow's story. She saw the India work, and she was like, "What is that from?" And I said, "That's a project I'm doing on widows." And she was like, "I want to do a story on widows. I just talked to our writer, Cynthia Gorney, about it." But her angle was Bosnia. She specifically wanted to look more about the cause of it. So it ended up being kind of a merging of widow ideas, and mine was very much about the marginalized widow and sort of the status of women. And I think Susan's was more about maybe the cause of widowhood, that there's so many more widows. So we kind of, maybe you should finish.
And I'd like to say that's an anomaly, but it's not. A magazine, I think you wouldn't come to work in a magazine if you didn't believe it was a collaborative process. And it's not, it's not the photographer's decision in the end. It's not the photo editor's decision in the end. There's a lot of people who are making this project and who are invested in it deeply. And I think Susan was also very personally invested in it because she was a widow herself. Now, she was a widow in the U.S. It was a very different story for her, but it struck her that way too. So having to kind of bring together personal interests and then different journalistic interests of a photojournalist and the writer, and then you have a couple editors who are trying to figure out how to make sense of all this. So that's something that happens more often than not, actually, when forming, especially for Geographic. The way we do stories is pretty intense. It's more like producing a I know there's some filmmakers in the room, so maybe I won't say this, but it's kind of more like producing a documentary film in the sense that the budgets and the length of time we usually spend on a story, this was started in 2013, essentially, and then by the time it came to us in 2015, early, and was published in early 2017. So I spent 2 years working on it at the magazine after Amy had already spent years and invested in it, and more so thinking about it. So,
but what's interesting about the thing I'll say about Bosnia, though, is in the end, I think the writer had really struggled with it. Cynthia was like, how do I put these together? And she has to more so weave that. And I think visually it was a little easier to weave it together. But I don't know, there was something really that it lightened the look a little bit of just being able to, it brought it back to a story about women, sort of like in a bigger way, I think.
Well, and how they were sort of struggling with these issues decades after this thing had happened, and how they were sort of leaning on each other for support in a way that some of the other stories didn't show that much community.
Right.
Well, at least Uganda so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd love to talk actually now more about Uganda, but I think we should we have a little video. The Pulitzer Center, after we finished the photo story, after Amy had finished all of her reporting, we had kind of an itch to go back and do a video piece. And I can say it absolutely would not have happened without the support from the Pulitzer Center. We simply were not going to invest in this at the magazine. So it was great that they came on board, and they sent Amy and one of our video producers on staff back to Uganda to work on a piece of the story. Yep,
Yeah,
Catherine. So
yeah.
maybe just go ahead and play
This
that.
is a 3-minute version of a 10-minute documentary.
Ne bantwalako n'abaana bange.
Bannumba gye nkolera ne bansikayo.
Yagezaako kuntema n'ejjambiya.
Bagezaako kungoba mu maka gange naye ate nga sirina wala wenzira.
Bantiisa okunzisa n'abaana bange bwe mba sivudde maka muno.
Yagezaako okunkwata.
Ettaka lyange baalitwala, sikyasobola kuliisa baana.
Bantwalako ebintu byange byonna emirundi ebiri. Bwe kubeera nnamwandu bwe kitegeeza mu Uganda.
The cultural tradition around property grabbing is the effect that when a man dies, the clan is automatically entitled to inherit his entire estate, including his wife. So she's property. We must understand that in these communities, land is everything. Land is equated to life. People kill for land. If you have land, then you have a voice.
Olunaku olwo omwami wange lwe yafa lwali lwa nnaku nnyo ku sayidi yange, naye nze saamanya nti nno mulwadde wa siriimu yankweka.
Enkuba bakubye ku lwaffe, enjala ewalume ku lwaffe.
Ekyo nze nakimanya luvannyuma. Natandikirawo okuyisibwa obubi abaana b'omwami wange. Ye mutabani wange oyo omukulembeze kansala ategeera amateeka eyaleeta abantu, ate ng'abantu abo yagula bagule okujja okuntulugunya. Ne bajja n'emiggo ne bagisuula mu Stenseni wali mu kkubo, emmotoka ne ziyitako nga ziyita ku Stenseni mu mmotoka, ku mmere nga kweyita emmere etalimika, okulima banne nga kuzibu. Ne batwala ensolo zange ezaali awaka. Kale kyannuma nnyo okulaba ng'ente yange bagikubye neefa, okulaba nga bankozesa endagaano ku kifuba egabe ekintu. Yo ogenda kunkola ki? Gw'olina ssente mmeka? Onumpa waabirawa? Yo ononkola ki? Byenkoledde emyaka ne bigenda mu ddakiika entono ennyo bwetyo. Ekirala ekyasinga okunnuma, omukulembeze oyo wasajja kansala ye yaŋŋamba nti entaana y'omwana yiiri ngikulekeddewo, totawaana okusima entaana. Era ekifaananyi ekyo kyandaga bulala nnyo.
So I think that does a pretty good job of introducing us to kind of the situation in Uganda. Do you want to talk a little bit about, was there a particular widow whose story stuck with you?
She's the one that was sort of looping through. There's a woman in a very colorful dress in a blue building, Solomé. So when this is a classic moment of reporting, yeah, that's Solomé. So we have this limited time and this tight budget, and you got to get to the country and get started, and you think you've made it really clear with everybody about the day you're going to start and everything. So I got to Kampala maybe on a Wednesday, and wanted to get started like Thursday morning. And the International Justice Mission, who we were working with, was like, sorry, we actually are having a retreat up north, and everybody was gone. Excuse me. Which meant that we weren't going to be able to start till Monday. So it's like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. That is so much money, and it like you definitely like want to die as the photographer. You're like, oh my God, I'm gonna die. So my scrappy fixer Halima and I just set out on our own to go find some widows. So we drove to a completely different district than what the district we were going to work with this NGO. And she called on her contacts who had done some stories about widows, because property grabbing in Uganda is a big, like 3 out of 5 widows experience it, which is a lot, and even more getting threatened with it, but 3 out of 5 are actually victims of it, where let me actually just explain it quickly again. I know the video explained it, but basically a woman just traditionally does not inherit the land there. And so even though the laws, there's a 1995 constitution that protects her, culturally has not caught up with the actual constitution. So literally what will happen is a woman's husband will die, and then his family will immediately be there, like literally at the funeral, ready to take things from the house. So it's and it can be really violent, and it's very immediate, and it's physically scary. It's really frightening. So we found this woman in this other district who was doing some grassroots work with the widows there. She had created her own little widows association, very low key. And she said, oh my gosh, I know this woman whose husband died 3 days ago. And so we said, okay, would you feel comfortable introducing us? And she did, and that was Solomé. And we met Solomé at her house, and she was completely shaken. She was there with other members of her family, her son, and actually her mother-in-law, the mother of some of the perpetrators. And at the funeral, they went and buried her husband's body. They'd been boyfriend and girlfriend since they were 17, then they got married. They were in their 50s, so they were completely like high school sweethearts, and she was so sad. And then on top of it, when she got back to have the like traditional ceremony at her house, his brothers came and a few of his sisters, and they chased all the guests away, threatened people with their lives, and then threatened them that they were going to kill them if they don't leave the house. They went in her closet and took all her clothes out and burned them in the front yard. It just was incredibly intimidating and scary, and they were so shaken and ready to get in a car and just drive to Kampala. They lived maybe a half hour outside of Kampala, and just get out because they were scared. And we continued to visit Solomé over a number of days, and I watched her as she learned about what her actual rights were. It was really interesting to watch her go from this incredibly shaken, scared woman to somebody who had kind of pulled her resources together, and by the end, she was adamant that she was going to fight it. And she said she had this saying that was really awesome. She said, you know what, I'm going to fight this, and I'm going to drink it like soup, which was awesome. Like, I'd never heard that saying before, but of course it makes sense. It was really great. So, and she went back to her home and was like, let them come get me. You know, I have the rights to fight this, and I'm going to fight it. And that was really amazing to watch that transformation with just the knowledge of the law standing behind her.
I was struck. I was rereading Cynthia's piece, and the piece kind of ends with a similar story of a woman who, kind of stands up for herself and fights, to kind of embrace the law. But then it ends with this note of basically we hope she's okay, because,
Yeah.
you know, she kind of goes
Claire.
back to her town and she's staying in her house and there's just so much threat against her. So how much did you kind of feel that, even though there's been this law of 20 years, it's
Yeah.
not well enforced. And I think
Right.
even in the piece they mention that it's almost understood that the family would come and take the property and the land and
Yeah.
the women themselves and their children.
It's right, and the children too. So what happened was International Justice Mission recognized this problem. This is the organization that also does the human trafficking. And they said, okay, let's take this test district, Mukono district, right outside Kampala, and let's see if we take that constitution, those laws that actually give women full equality in inheritance, and we educate the whole legal pipeline. So we'll educate the cops, we'll educate the judges, the magistrate, everybody. We're just going to educate everybody, and we'll take women on as clients because they have Ugandan lawyers that work with them. And they also have their own private detectives that help the police. Because in Uganda, it's so poor that if you have your car stolen there or your house robbed, you actually have to pay the police to like make any kind of investigation happen. They just have no resources. It's so poor. So that's their test sort of district, and they've been doing it since 2007, and it's definitely shifted. But the thing that Halima, my fixer, and I felt over and over again is like, shit, what's going to happen when they leave? And, you know, and I think Halima, as somebody who is from Uganda, she's seen that happen over and over again, where the NGOs come in, things get better, and then they pull out, and everything goes back. So I don't know. I'm not sure. I did see quite an incredible, like, thing where I met people who were like, I thought that this is just what happens, that it should go back to the man, but now I understand that that's not right. And you did see people kind of making those connections, but in a place that's so poor and opportunistic with land, I could see it also shifting right back.
I just want to say, jumping back over to the photographs themselves for a second, you know, Amy mentioned earlier that pulling off Uganda was really hard. And I think what I also forgot to say was that, you know, as you watch the video, the women are talking about all these things that happened in their past, right? And Amy, when recounting when she met Salome, just 3 days after her husband had died, she's still talking about all these things, these very visual things that had happened in the past. And of course, as a photo editor,
you're like, why don't you have that, Amy?
Because
is that what you're thinking?
Yeah.
So I'm saying it, thanks.
Yeah. So, and it's really hard because here's these awful things that are happening to people, and their real life is, you know, being turned upside down, and Amy missed it. And so, and this was kind of the sort of challenge throughout the whole story. And I think from the beginning with Uganda is how are we going to, because I'm sitting there in DC going, well, of course, we're going to get these guys coming to someone's house and ripping her furniture and her clothing and her children away from her. But of course, very hard to actually have happen. I mean, what are you going to do? Sit there and kind of wait for someone to die? I mean, that's kind of crass and also just hard to pull off logistically.
It's also like photographing. It's like photographing domestic violence, though.
Yeah.
Like there's no way on some level they know it's wrong and they do it in the dark.
Right.
Yeah.
And then even the kind of all the legal pieces of the story as well. I mean, Amy went on this kind of harrowing police chase, and also, you know, we had to talk a lot about how to kind of make a picture that would get at all the legal paperwork as well, which I think you've seen kind of looping through there.
Right.
But, you know, it was not an easy task to tell that story and to try to think of what are the visual elements that we can actually, you know, use to tell these pieces of the story.
Yeah.
So kudos to Amy for actually pulling that off. I do want to jump to questions in just a minute, but I guess kind of to end with for Amy, what did you learn from these widows who are facing such daunting challenges?
Oh my gosh, these stories are so amazing. I think any, yourself included as the editor, I think like these are such experiences when you work on these stories. The most incredible thing is to like let them change you. I think sadly, one of the biggest things, I mean, sadly or not sadly, is just how freaking lucky I am, how lucky we all are, that we're born in the country that we're born in. That I think just by being a woman and born in these places, they are automatically set up to be put in extremely marginalized situations. And that's really hard to reconcile. It's really hard to get your head around it. That's not really learning, I guess. It's just more sort of feeling. I felt devastated a lot of this assignment.
Would you do more work on this story, or do you think it's done? I mean, it's something you've obviously been thinking about for a long time.
You know, I'm trying to figure that out this year. I'm at University of Michigan this year for a journalism fellowship, and I'm focusing a lot on women's studies. While working on this story, I got very interested in rural women's movements, like especially in India, like not the Delhi-educated Indian women, but the rural women and what sort of feminist movements are happening. So I could see it transitioning into that, but I also think it's still an important story to tell. I think it's something that's, you know, it's really relevant in the Middle East right now. It's really, you know, with the war-torn places. But I do think that it keeps going back to the status of women, and so I'm interested in letting that story evolve somehow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's open it up for questions if you guys have any. Who wants to jump in?
In India, just being a divorced woman or a widow kind of comes with the same baggage. One of my fixers in India, in West Bengal, she left her husband. So she wasn't abandoned, but she left her husband. And I asked her, she's got a daughter, and I said, you know, would you ever remarry? And she was like, hell no. And she said, no matter what, unless I met the most like progressive man in India, they're always gonna think of me as sort of spoiled. Like, she's like, even if I go on a date with them and they're interested in me, there will always be this power play that she's like, I don't want to ever deal with. And so there's just a stigma with it. Uganda, less so. In Uganda, you don't enter widowhood necessarily. Like India, you enter widowhood and you're there. Uganda, it's much more acceptable to remarry. Bosnia, you enter widowhood as well if you have children with your husband that died. If your husband dies before you have children, then it's more socially acceptable to remarry. But I think more in India, to not be attached to a man is pretty harsh. Yeah. Trying to think if we had that conversation about getting those ethically. You mean in terms of like how, like maybe give an example of what you think.
Like with Salome, you had mentioned, you know, you wouldn't sit there and like wait for a violent event to happen. Like, what are some of the, I don't know, I guess like your thought process.
For like how to tackle that?
Yeah, or like, you know, being an interloper but not being an interloper.
Right.
I don't know.
You know, I think the ethics in these situations is a frickin' ongoing, every moment question that in the field you're asking yourself, you know, and I wouldn't ever to pretend that I'm like the ethical pure one, you know. I think it's a continuum, and I think that it's a constant question of like, okay, did I go too far with that? Like, would that be too far? Is this okay? And I think, to me, that's the best you can do, is to constantly kind of check in with yourself, and then even check in with your editor if you have to. Or even if there's something that happened, you check in with your editor and be like, you know, this image is this, but I feel like this happened around it, and I'm not sure if that's cool or not. Like, I think it's just about transparency. Specifically with like trying to get in on these situations, I don't see any ethical problem with, like, if I had happened to be there on the day of the funeral, I don't have any ethical problems with photographing that. That would have been my job, essentially. You know, there was a moment with Salome, so like, imagine if this is her yard, it was probably about as big as this room. And then there was like a line of trees right there and the house right next to them that was one of the perpetrators that had come, and they were right there. So we were, myself and Halima, and then sometimes Cynthia, the writer, was there. Like, we were all kind of around off and on throughout the course of a couple weeks. Like, we'd come visit her and find out how she was doing. And they were always kind of there. And what I was talking about before with Salome kind of like rebuilding herself and her sense of like, I'm gonna stay at my home, was kind of building throughout this. And one of the perpetrators kind of came to the edge, and I pointed my camera at them, and they ran. And then there was a moment where they came over closer, and I pointed my camera at them again, you know, and there was a moment where I was kind of like, wow, this is really interesting to, like, I had to be really honest with myself about how much influence I had, and honestly, like, if me being there on some level kept Salome safer in some respects, or like, I don't really mind that. But I think some people might say that unethically you're supposed to be more invisible. I would never pretend to be invisible in those situations. I think that I have a huge impact on my subjects. The question is, you know, how make sure I'm honoring them and that maintaining truth to their story, I guess.
I think also, I mean, I don't know if this is about ethics, kind of about ethics. You know, being an editor or collaborating with photographers at National Geographic and in other places too, I'm not just, I mean, I don't know how people here define being a picture editor, but I'm not just picking the pictures after they come back or moving pixels around, as I think Wikipedia defines it. We don't do that at National Geographic. But for us, it's really about being involved in the project really early on. So I would say a lot of those questions, you know, we're kind of sorting throughout the course of the research and the planning and making sure that we're approaching the story from a way overall that feels, you know, honest and accurate. You know, I was having dinner with John Stanmeyer the other day, and he said something like, 99% of photography is logistics and research. 1% is photography. It's probably a little more. And it's 100% serendipity. You know, like, the magic obviously happens in the moment, but the amount of research that we put in at the magazine, you know, myself, Edward Benfield, our coordinator, Amy, the nonprofit organizations we were partnering with, the text editor. So there are a lot of voices, Cynthia, the writer, kind of, you know, triangulating and trying to make sure we were getting it right. And then National Geographic also looks at every single frame. So, you know, we also try to, when we're editing the piece, actually picking the pictures in collaboration with the photographer, we can see what's happened, you know, so we can kind of see the arc of what has happened in that moment when the photographer is working too. So I think that answers some questions also. We did actually, and then of course at the very end, after the pictures have been selected and, you know, before we go to press, our legal team, which is now part of 21st Century Fox out in Los Angeles, you know, looks at everything as well. And the picture in here that we'll come to in a few moments of one of the perpetrators behind bars, there were, you know, we had to kind of go back and forth about that. You know, what do we know? Is this person, you know, is he accused? Is he, you know, what can we actually say about him that is accurate? You know, so that's obviously, I think, on the other side of what you were asking, but, you know, there's a lot of checks and balances. Okay, a bunch of hands. The student here in the front.
I would say only one picture. We kind of did that with.
This one.
Yeah, this one. You know, and Uganda is definitely more heavy-handed. It's a lot of portraits. This is a portrait. This was definitely, but this place exists. So this is what a court archive looks like in Kampala. But that was
where many of those courts are dealing specifically with property grabbing cases. So we're trying to think of what kind, we're imagining in our heads, you know, what kind of picture could possibly have an impact about the legality of the situation and kind of the burden of the paperwork and how many cases there are. And I remember when that picture came up at the final show at Geographic, everyone was like, oh, wow, we get it now.
Yeah.
And this one, was a case where I was like, Amy, you got to get a perpetrator. Just get a perpetrator. I don't care where he is. And then he was in jail. It was even better.
That's a ridiculous picture. Yeah.
But, it also, I think, with even the portraits of the women in front of their homes, I mean, that was not, Amy typically doesn't shoot a lot of portraits, not a lot of setup portraits, and I'm sort of forcing her down that path, like go and make these portraits of these women in front of their houses. This is the very thing that could be taken away from them. And right. She agreed.
Yeah. I submitted. That's an interesting question because it's kind of you can talk to the legalities my impression from where I sit at Geographic, I've been working with them since '99. There was never any sort of request for model releases. And then it's sort of been slowly building. And then I think now there's a big request for it. We didn't really worry about it here, but I think there's a big one. The 21st century.
We don't require them for most pictures. We certainly, if you can get one, that's better. I'll put it at that. If you can come back with a model release for everything, fantastic. We realize that's probably impossible in a lot of situations. We definitely need it in situations with minors, so kids under the age of 18. And that would be their parent. Right? Covers, if there's any pictures that we want to run on the cover of the magazine, because that's a commercial space, then we need a release in most cases. Also in kind of, particular situations, hospitals, for instance. So there's a little bit of flexibility around it, but, if you can get one, it's better.
It's interesting. So Betty, who you saw in the documentary, and there's a couple pictures of her as well, so she married her husband who was older. Uganda gets really complicated because there's polygamy and a lot of wives, and it gets really complicated. But her husband was like maybe in his 60s. She was very young, maybe a 20s or something. Wills are considered kind of bad luck. Nobody wants to talk about them. So it's just culturally like you don't talk about your will. But he drew up his will very clearly, and he gave it to he had like a younger man who he had kind of mentored. It was part of the family, like in a distant way, like a cousin or something. Wasajo was his name. He gave him that will and said, please protect Betty and make sure that this will is carried out. So when she was first a victim of property grabbing, when he died by her stepchildren, Wasacha came in the picture and said, like, hold on, here's the will. He's written it out very clearly. He knew that would happen. And he managed to help her get her piece of land. Then 10 years later, Wasacha came back and became the perpetrator of Betty. So these are really complex stories. They get, these are family stories. They're really, and there's power plays. And so yes, the men realize it. There's many who do wills, but very, very often they're not legal, or they don't want to have them out in public. So, these are very rural places.
I think what we saw time and time again was that, there's what's written in stone legally, and what is enforced by the Constitution, and then what actually happens in reality, of course, is, in Uganda at least, quite different. So.
Yeah, I definitely had more, and I've worked on, I don't, it's not like I'm a war photographer and I haven't worked in like really that's not my whole body of work, but I've worked in, like, working with refugees can be really, children refugees. But there were moments, there were like really distinct moments on this assignment where I definitely kind of like just had like almost kind of falling on the floor feeling of just like, what the hell, like just anger, and just really feeling it. But then you're kind of like, what am I to feel this? Like, they're the ones that have it bad. So then you end up in this whole cycle where you have this, like, you know, you find some sort of reconciliation, maybe falsely, that your work is maybe going to help in some way. I don't know. I think it's ripple effects, but that's kind of what you have to go back to, because it's not like I'm entitled to wallow in some sort of pity about it. But it is empowering to think that you can sort of get the story out for what it's worth. And I don't think it changes the world, but I think it does help. It's a part of a bigger movement, I think. Yeah.
Maybe that's what you can spend part of your year thinking about, is like who your next partner organization will be to take the story and actually put it out there in the world even further.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a...
Okay, we have one last question here.
Solome's son, Dan, is in his 20s. And that's a whole nother complicated part of the story, is that they were threatening his life too. So the uncles were older. So it's also about, maybe if she had a brother that protected her that was of the same age as the in-laws that were trying to take the land, I think that could help. But in their 20s, he's still like a punk, just they're supposed to get the land before him. It's very hierarchical with age and gender. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming out. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.